So hello to the conference participants of the ISSRNC in Cork, Ireland. My name is Dianne Quigley. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of research at SUNY ESF, adjunct faculty at Middlesex Community College and Lowell, Massachusetts, and also the principal investigator of the Northeast Ethics Education Partnership. I want to thank the conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to give you a video presentation of an important survey we have done with environmental field researchers on ethical approaches to field research with place-based communities. And we're doing this through the findings from the NEEP survey with environmental field researchers. NEEP sought to gain actual guidance from environmental researchers on how they were implementing bioethical principles with place-based communities in field research. Our collaborators, who I've been working with over a decade, are all concentrating on how to increase community protections and bioethical protections for research in the field. So in this survey, we asked participants through a Qualtrics survey to comment and give us reports of how they implemented beneficence, non-maleficence, respect for communities and persons, and justice through community engaged and culturally competent approaches, how they actually did this in the field. This information is needed for graduate students in ethical approaches to environmental field research, drawing on their actual field experiences of environmental researchers. We've provided some training to graduate students to prepare them to work in ethical ways in place-based communities, and we lacked any information really on actual field experiences except from research reports we had in the published literature. So we thought we would expand on this through this survey, and we hope these findings can be used for moral guidance in working with place-based communities affected by climate change, water and other resource depletion pressures, environmental sciences, and environmental health. So we have a special focus on land-based communities and traditional ecological knowledge. This focus is on the justice principle of bioethical protections. It will require an appreciation of diverse knowledge systems, TEK beliefs, and research methods of land-based communities. So we have a sample of diverse cultural knowledge values, data collection methods, and other critical TEK beliefs and evidence that are reviewed for promoting climate justice and research ethics. So we come to our survey findings. The guidance we have for beneficence, we were really surprised. We had 76% of 187 researchers who reported that they created ancillary benefits to communities in their research activities. So along with their research question and investigation, they had all these categories of secondary benefits to place-based communities: dissemination of materials and findings, education, empowerment, access to resources, specific skills training, collaboration and engagement activities, increased community participation, communication benefits and increased knowledge, ethical protections, and inclusiveness. Another finding were benefits for working with stakeholders, which were very strong. We found that researchers reported that there were improved relations with government officials, with community members, which stand out for increasing services, improving communication problems, and increasing joint planning and sensitivity to community needs and problems. Other stakeholder relations also were emphasized. Traders met with other stakeholders for the first time, which became crucial for recognition of their efforts in conservation of agricultural biodiversity. Indeed, one of these traders later became the liaison for the Slow Food Biodiversity International Project. Access to resources also came out to me as a kind of new finding for what researchers were able to provide communities for benefits. So there were a robust list of resources that community members were able to access due to the research effort and the help of researchers. These were research products, jobs and financial resources, health services, livelihood benefits, adult education, links to government officials, and published articles that would bring broad attention to their need for assistance with some of their adverse conditions. Throughout the findings, I saw a lot of local voices and listening, building a voice for empowerment for communities to tell their own stories about conditions, histories, collective stories of self-determination, planning and decision-making, confidence building, and leadership development. In one quote, we had, "Communities are not homogeneous or equal in access to power. Care is always needed to be taken to try to ensure that marginalized people and people without voice are included in all aspects of carrying out community research. This is never easy and can be resisted by those with power. Body language and voice are important to working through the process. Invite the community to input rather than taking charge and being authoritative. With non-maleficence, do no harm, the guidance we got from field researchers was also important. We find generally that many communities with diverse races, low-income groups, or resource-poor areas have experienced research harms, stigmatization, researcher arrogance, or negligent treatment of community members, violation of cultural protocols, refusal to include or consult with community about research plans, burdensome requests for community assistance, and the lack of any benefit to community needs. But in these results, we had these major nodes organized around researcher responses. An emphasis on ensuring cultural protection and harm prevention, promoting cultural sensitivity, using community-based research methods, working with liaisons in the community, again developing collaborations and partnerships, consulting stakeholders with research designs, developing inclusive recruitment of community stakeholders and providing anonymity, confidentiality, and privacy protections. In non-maleficence, a lot of responses talked about protecting confidential information and cultural resources. Responses supported protecting identities, locations, and enforcing human subjects protection. We always have local co-researchers involved with engagement with wider publics and discuss beforehand issues of confidentiality. But we show copies of past reports and ask whether the use of their thoughts and images is okay in such reports, especially on websites which are widely public. The biggest threat we have is that our collaborators operate with far less sense of confidentiality than is our norm. So we need to request that they really do not pressure people to participate. So communities also will report adverse impacts to their local ecosystems from researchers. So one quote was, "People who study, like, or depend upon one part of the biota want to make sure that your work, even though it will improve an ecosystem, will not damage parts that are of value to those people who are living in that area. You may have to make compromises in your design or in carrying out of a study or project to assure the protection of the valued part of that ecosystem." For non-maleficence, we also have improving research designs, contacting local government with research plans before engaging local communities, immersing researchers in the community before research is developed, and again emphasizing empathy and respect for emotions and apologizing for mistakes. Work with the community in order to be flexible with designs, have user-centered designs such as visual imagery and photo elicitation, and always try to use a bottom-up approach and have locals grace for information and review research plans. Now, respect for communities and persons, which we often have under informed consent. We had 53% of 71 researchers use cultural and community representatives to obtain local community and individual consent. So they didn't do it themselves. They had these liaisons help. And community members had a lot of fear of consent processes, especially signing forms, frequently recorded and strongly voiced. They need assurance of confidentiality with consent forms, procedures to reduce their fears of identifiable information, and stigmatization of individuals and communities. So some of the interesting results for consent for field guidance were that respondents recommend working side by side with community members in developing a participatory model and designing consent procedures. Dialogue is critical. Opportunities that promote a face-to-face process of explaining information, answering questions, consulting with community members about appropriate language, and offering information through focus groups, relationship building, work parties, nature walks, and children programs are valuable methods. This was all very new information if you study consent processes. Spend time on translating research terms into community meetings, create visuals and photographs, ensure community ownership of data and security of confidential data. Another very important finding was ongoing consent is needed. So working with research communities by gaining consent on an ongoing basis, not just the first time out with a consent form, that was seen as more vital than the consent document, setting a tone for respect and engagement, and for future research ethics needs. One researcher stated that training is needed on how research generates power for themselves and the research participants. For the justice category, which is usually about fair selection of subjects, fair risks and benefits, and fair treatment of study populations. Our team focused in on community-based research and cultural competence as a way to increase justice. So we asked, did CBPR increase protections and benefits? And of course, we had a lot of positive responses. CBPR methods improve dissemination, consent protections, promote community participation, collaboration, engagement, access to resources, empowerment capacity, communication, knowledge, and safety and inclusiveness. But CBPR does have risks, and risks are things that we'll be working on and trying to overcome. Some of that might be research integrity, the competence of community staff in collecting data and doing interviews. Issues of fair recruitment will require researchers to confront any polarization in the community that would marginalize some community members. CBPR will have confidentiality and privacy risks, which would be obvious when you're having group exposure and group meetings, and you might have some instances of possible coercive group consent pressures. And CBPR methods require research teams to work on internal community conflicts and work with communication sensitivity. So this is sort of the work to be done in best practices with CBPR in place-based communities. We had, again, cultural competence and appropriateness, guidance, and fair treatment. Carefully enter culturally diverse communities. Have advisory and review committees to provide critical input into designs, methods, and dissemination. Promote a face-to-face approach, visual processes recommended, mapping, visioning, images, pictures. Listen to stories, respect seasonal activities and rhythms, open up to diverse cultural interpretations and meanings, respect spiritual symbolic dimensions of a community experience, and use their local knowledge again. So I matched these findings to findings in the literature on traditional ecological knowledge, which there are abundant numbers of studies on TEK. And we find that field researchers promote a respect for TEK and cultural spiritual beliefs in research designs and methods. So important findings emerge from these studies that support this justice principle of respecting local knowledge and beliefs, particularly for research with climate change and land-based communities. And particularly for resiliency for land-based communities, they say morality, ethics, and adaptation need much attention. Knowledge and practices may change due to metascale forces. Perhaps what is responsible for resiliency among these changes is a traditional moral code, which may inform selective socio-ecological adaptations. A researcher's moral code should include the need to learn about a local moral code in order to fully report on community resiliency with traditional beliefs. So, for providing some moral guidance with TEK and land-based communities with the justice principle, we have that when local traditions, knowledge practices with landscapes are forced out by dominating Western knowledge and administrative systems, these vulnerable communities lose adaptive capacity for climate change. So here are a few considerations that are critical when working with these communities. Are decisions based on local experience, respect for local institutions? Do you have flexible institutional decision making, trust and social bonds, local leadership? How is power sharing dealt with? How are you having mutual learning? What's the nature of official regulations, the dominant religion? So for TEK and positive adaptations, Ruiz, Mellon, and Colbora report 4 critical mechanisms through which TEK results in positive adaptations in contexts of community-based conservation. Number 1, people will elaborate knowledge about ecosystems by testing it iteratively and learn from crises and management mistakes. They transmit and guard it locally, adjusting management practices to new social ecological states arising after perturbations. An interpretation of ecosystem change is related to the traditional ceremonies and rituals that contribute to the cultural internalization of conservation rules. And here again, we highlight the importance of these ceremonies and rituals in local knowledge. These rules lead to flexible decision making. When convenience technologies replace critical cultural and moral values, they force the loss of community members' indigenous cultural identity and the adoption of the dominant social paradigm. So we have a few examples from Puno, Peru, in the water management of the agriculture of the Altiplano. There's an intimate relationship in which social, cultural, and ecological are all part of a single web of knowledge, symbols, meanings, and survival. It's key to environmental management and the sustainable development of these communities. So you have to have high regard for these cultural heritage programs, for the successful regeneration and cultivation of traditional, communal, and local ethno-ecological knowledge. The Inuit with polar bear management had problems when the resiliency of the Inuit were undermined by power-sharing conflicts between Inuit people and conservation management. And this led to conflicts fueled by lack of transparency, trust, and communication, and weakened their adaptive capacity to cope with change and achieve conservation. In Maine fisheries, too, there was a strong imposition of official management regulations, jeopardizing local adaptive capacity, as shown by catch shares imposed in Maine fisheries to protect groundfish. Catch shares excluded local knowledge, social rules, and informal sanctions from decision-making processes, and failed to sustain fish populations and fishermen's livelihood. So these are just a few examples of how important appreciating local knowledge, local cultural traditions, spiritual beliefs, and symbolic meanings. So I would just again like to thank our co-authors, Alana Levine, David Sonnenfeld from SUNY ESF, Dr. Phil Brown from Northeastern, King Tian and Shafon Wei. We'd like to acknowledge National Science Foundation, Ethics Education and Science Engineering, and we're grateful to this video presentation of this lecture by Middlesex Community College. This survey was recently published in Science and Engineering Ethics, 2019, number 25. You could look this up and find all of these best practices that researchers reported in the field, and perhaps use this to promote your own graduate student training and ethical approaches to field research with place-based communities. Thank you very much for an opportunity to present.